For over 500 years, a series of hypermasculinized, authoritarian, and totalitarian leaders have subjected Russia to their rule, beginning with the Tsars and culminating in Vladimir Putin of the United Russia Party today. The one question that really comes to mind when contemplating this fact is, why do the people of Russia keep subjecting themselves to the oppressive rule of these hypermasculinized, authoritarian leaders even into the present day? The answer to that question involves several key factors. The three main factors that shape Russia's continued election of these supermasculine authoritarian leaders are: 1. Russia has had a deep cultural history of extremely masculine and paternalistic leaders. 2. The economic and political failure of a series of weak late Soviet-era leaders and early post-Soviet-era leaders caused a backlash in Russian society and a turn back towards authoritarianism in recent years. And 3. There is a crisis of masculinity in post-Soviet-era Russia. In a comparative table listing institutional characteristics of various regimes and socio-political systems, Dr. Lev Gudkov characterizes the authoritarian leader as a strong man, a national leader, macho, the father of the nation, and a bearer of conservative and traditionalist ideals and myth. All of the czars of Russia pretty much fully embodied this hypermasculinized persona. Up until and through Nicholas II, the czars often portrayed themselves in hypermasculinized ways. Oftentimes they would portray themselves in full military decor, with all of their war medals adorning their uniforms in order to emphasize their paternalistic role as the father of the nation and the leader of the military. In the same comparative table mentioned previously, Dr. Gudkov describes totalitarian leaders as charismatic or pseudo-charismatic supreme leaders, and as having an organized cult of supreme leader as father or savior of the nation. Of all the Soviet leaders, none embodies this stereotype more fully than Joseph Stalin, who would often portray himself in an omniscient, godlike manner. Much of Stalin's propaganda features portraits of himself staring solemnly into the distance, overlooking the Russian people. Many political scientists today see Stalin's reign as an almost perfect characterization of a totalitarian regime, and Stalin himself is an almost perfect characterization of the totalitarian leader. Stalin was so ruthless that he even had his son sent to prison. Despite the huge amount of the Russian people who died at Stalin's hands, or on his orders, contemporary Russians today see Stalin in a surprisingly positive light. Many Russians still hold on to the same paternalistic image of Stalin as a larger-than-life, father-like, and godlike leader. There are many Russians today who are willing to overlook or excuse the horrible atrocities that Stalin committed because of the fact that his hypermasculinized, totalitarian rule was largely responsible for putting Russia on the map as a world superpower. The YouTube video, Epic Rap Battles of History, Rasputin vs. Stalin, is a great example of what a modern portrayal of Stalin looks like. The video is chock full of references to both Stalin's atrocities and to his greatness. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991, it seemed as though Russia had a chance to reform their historically authoritarian system. However, with the widespread failure of Boris Yeltsin's liberal democratic reform policies, the country shifted back towards a more authoritarian way of governing, with the aid of neoconservative policies implemented by Vladimir Putin. Originally intended to be a democracy, the Russian Federation took a turn towards authoritarianism in the late 1990s with the election of Putin to the presidency and the implementation of all of his new policies. This distinct new breed of authoritarianism, Putinism, includes what Dr. Gudkov calls a media president who is imbued with the charisma of a national leader. However, unlike Stalin and his Soviet contemporaries, Putin does not really control the state. It only seems like he does. He is actually the face of a small group of elites who pull the strings and tell him what to do, kind of like puppeteers. Putin, just like the Soviet leaders and the czars before that, represents himself in an extremely masculine way. With the stranglehold that Putin has on the Russian media, he often is shown engaging in any number of masculine activities, including co-piloting a jet fighter plane, fishing shirtless and baring his muscular chest for all to see in southern Siberia, and showing off judo moves in any number of public places. which includes a mass-marketed instructional video titled "Let's Learn Judo with Vladimir Putin." In her discourse titled "Soviet Masculinities," Dr. Amy Randall asserts, Putin has served as an icon of renewed Russian masculinity, exuding vigor, strength, and control. So on the one hand, Putin has made Russia competitive again on an international scale, and according to Dr. Randall, his strong male persona symbolizes Russia's growing economic might and its reassertion as a world power. On the other hand, though, he is clearly controlled by a group of oligarchs who act in their own interests far more often than in the interests of the people. Dr. Jeffrey Mainkoff asserts that, because of the weakness of Russia's political parties, the state too often does more for the benefit of autonomous social cliques than for the masses. Russia is very politically weak because these oligarchs keep acting in their own interests and refuse to bolster the Russian people as a whole. In his study, Who Has Led Russia? Russian Regional Political Elites from 1954 to 2006, Dr. Joel Moses finds that there are far more similarities than differences between regional elites from the Soviet era and from the post-Soviet era. So is Putin just a continuation of the czars and the Soviet leaders? Dr. Moses found in his study that the turnover rates and average tenure in office since 1992 very closely resembles the average turnover rates and time in office during the Soviet era, which suggests that Russia is still politically and economically corrupt. It's no wonder that in a survey conducted to compare political efficacy in Russia and Ukraine in 2010, Russians and Ukrainians were asked to evaluate the extent to which ordinary people could influence the central government in their own countries, and over half, 53% to be exact, of the Russian people polled voted not at all. With Putin in office and with his continued dominance in Russian politics up until the present day, it seems as though Russian politics will continue to be subject to domination by this group of elites. However, with the gradual implementation of liberal democratic reforms, a shift towards equality is still very possible. So what does control of Russia by a small group of elites mean for its population? In the male population in particular, there is a crisis of masculinity occurring in Russian society. As Dr. Anna Tominka put it, late Soviet liberal discourse in both academia and society saw men as biologically, psychologically, and demographically weaker than women, engaging in risky behaviors that indicated a crisis of masculinity because of their inability to perform their traditional roles as family breadwinners. In many senses, the oligarchs are to blame for perpetuating this crisis because they are responsible for the low employment rates and many other reasons that many Russian men feel incapable of performing their basic duties as breadwinners. One of the roots of this crisis of masculinity is the gender role confusion that originated in Stalinist Russia. In her research on Soviet gender policy, Dr. Zana Chernova asserts that the gender policy of the Soviet state was neither consistent nor coherent and was at times discriminatory. This lack of an official gender policy would cause widespread confusion continuing even into the present day. In his paper on masculinity and power in Soviet schools, Dr. Thomas Ewing asserts that the opening up of certain professions to men, which were once solely designated for women, such as teaching, caused a gender crisis among the men of the Soviet Union. Dr. Ewing even states outright regarding male teachers in the Soviet Union, saying, "Men teachers were everywhere, but almost nowhere were they considered as men." This innate gender insecurity among Russian men in particular, is a large part of the reason why the Russian people keep turning to these hyper-masculinized, strongman leaders. In conclusion, there are any number of factors involved in Russia's continued election of hyper-masculinized leaders for hundreds of years on end, culminating in the election of Vladimir Putin today. However, the three main ones that we discussed were: 1. The Russian people have deep cultural and historical roots in the electing of authoritarian hyper-masculinized leaders. 2. The failure of late Soviet era and early post-Soviet era politicians has caused a shift back towards an authoritarian state following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. And 3. There is a crisis of masculinity in post-Soviet Russia that has instilled a widespread gender identity crisis in society.